Alvin York, the man who didn't want to fight. Imagine this. You are a deeply religious man. Violence goes against everything you believe in. You apply for conscientious objector status 3 times. The military rejects you every single time. They force you to become a soldier. And then on one bloody morning in France, you single-handedly kill at least 20 enemy soldiers, capture 132 prisoners, and seize 32 machine guns in one of the most incredible displays of combat heroism in military history. This isn't made up. This is the true story of Sergeant Alvin York, a poor blacksmith and farmer from Tennessee who became the most celebrated hero of World War I. A man called by General John Pershing the greatest civilian soldier of the war. A man who killed more Germans in a single engagement than some entire battalions. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Alvin York didn't want to be a soldier. He believed killing was wrong. So how did a pacifist backwoodsman become one of the deadliest warriors America has ever produced? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand how faith, duty, and raw courage collided on October 8th, 1918, to create a legend that echoes to this very day. Part 1. Born in the Mountains. Childhood and Early Years. The story of Alvin Cullum York begins on December 13th, 1887, in a place so remote that most Americans have never heard of it. Pall Mall, Tennessee. It wasn't really even a town. It was a scattering of log cabins deep in the mountains of Fentress County, near the border with Kentucky. This was frontier country, isolated, rugged, and desperately poor. Alvin was born in a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor. His parents, William Uriah York and Mary Elizabeth Brooks York, were subsistence farmers, which meant they grew just enough food to survive and nothing more. William also worked as a blacksmith during the off-season, hammering iron in a makeshift forge to earn a few extra dollars. But no matter how hard he worked, there was never enough money, never enough food, never enough of anything. Alvin was the third of 11 children, though 3 of his siblings died in infancy. That was normal in those days. Families buried their babies and kept working. There was no time for extended grief. Survival demanded constant effort. Life in the York household was defined by unrelenting labor. From the moment Alvin could walk, he was expected to help with farm work. He planted corn, tended to livestock, chopped firewood, hauled water from the creek. In the summers, the Tennessee heat was suffocating. In the winters, the cold cut through their thin clothes and the cracks in the cabin walls. There was no electricity, no plumbing, no comforts of any kind. Education was a luxury the York children could not afford. Alvin attended a one-room schoolhouse sporadically, but he was needed at home too often to get more than a rudimentary education. By the time he was a teenager, he could read and write, but only barely. He completed just 3 years of formal schooling. Most of his education came from the mountains themselves, because Alvin York learned to hunt at a very young age. And he was a natural. His father gave him an old muzzle-loading rifle when he was about 8 years old. That rifle became Alvin's most prized possession. He would disappear into the forests for hours, stalking deer, turkey, squirrels, rabbits, anything that could be eaten. And he almost never missed. Alvin had an uncanny ability to judge distances, to compensate for wind, to predict where an animal would move. He developed reflexes like a striking snake, and eyes that could spot the slightest movement in dense brush. Hunting wasn't a sport for Alvin. It was survival. The meat he brought home often meant the difference between his family eating or going hungry. So he took it seriously. He practiced constantly. He learned to move silently through the woods, to read tracks, to think like his prey. By the time he was a teenager, people throughout the mountains knew Alvin York was one of the best shots in Tennessee. But life was hard in other ways too. Alvin's father was a stern, sometimes harsh man. He worked his sons relentlessly and had little patience for weakness. He drank occasionally, and when he did, his temper could flare. Alvin learned early that life was unforgiving and that only the strong survived. Then, when Alvin was 24 years old, his father died suddenly. William Uriah York had been the family's anchor, and without him, everything fell apart. The burden of supporting the family fell on Alvin and his brothers. They farmed, they hunted, they took whatever work they could find. Alvin labored in logging camps, worked on railroads, did whatever paid a few dollars. It was during this period, in his early 20s, that Alvin York went off the rails. Part 2, The Wild Years and Redemption. With his father gone and the grinding weight of poverty crushing him, Alvin began drinking, heavily. He frequented bars and saloons, got into fights, gambled, and ran with a rough crowd. He wasn't a bad person, but he was angry, frustrated, and lost. The mountains were full of men like him, young, strong, with no future and no hope. Alvin became known as a troublemaker. He had a quick temper and wasn't afraid to use his fists. There were bar brawls, drunken shouting matches, and nights he couldn't remember. His mother prayed for him constantly, begging him to change his ways, but Alvin ignored her. He was spiraling downward, and he didn't care. Then, in 1914, something happened that changed everything. Alvin had been courting a young woman named Gracie Williams. One night, after yet another drinking binge, he was riding home on his mule when something inside him snapped. He later described it as a bolt of lightning striking his soul. He felt an overwhelming conviction that his life was wrong, that he was wasting the gifts God had given him, and that if he didn't change, he would be damned. Alvin York got off his mule, fell to his knees on the muddy road, and prayed. He begged God for forgiveness. He promised to turn his life around. And he did. Alvin joined the Church of Christ in Christian Union, a small fundamentalist Christian denomination that emphasized pacifism and non-violence. The church taught that all killing was wrong, that Jesus commanded his followers to turn the other cheek, and that Christians should never take up arms even in war. Alvin became a devoted believer. He stopped drinking immediately. He stopped fighting. He attended church services multiple times a week, studied the Bible obsessively, and became a Sunday school teacher. His transformation was so complete that people who had known him as a hellraiser barely recognized him. Alvin York, the drunken brawler, had become Alvin York, the devout Christian. He courted Gracie Williams properly and respectfully. He worked hard to support his mother and siblings. He became a respected member of his community. His life had purpose and meaning. And then, in April 1917, the United States entered World War I. And Alvin York's faith was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. Part 3. The Call to War and the Crisis of Conscience. When the draft notice arrived in June 1917, Alvin York was devastated. He believed that killing was wrong. The teachings of his church were clear. Christians should not participate in war. Violence violated the commandments of Jesus. He immediately applied for conscientious objector status. He wrote a letter explaining his religious beliefs and requesting an exemption from military service. He included a testimonial from his pastor, Rosier Pyle, attesting to his sincere faith. The application was denied. He appealed. Denied again. He appealed a third time. Denied. The reason was simple. The Church of Christ in Christian Union was not recognized by the federal government as an official Christian denomination. Only members of certain established pacifist churches, like the Quakers and Mennonites, could claim conscientious objector status. Alvin's church didn't qualify.
Every instinct told him that becoming a soldier was wrong. His faith said it was a sin. But the United States government said it was his duty. Alvin didn't know what to do. He felt like he was being forced to choose between God and his country. At Camp Gordon, Alvin proved to be an exceptional soldier in every way. He was disciplined, obedient, and physically strong. And on the rifle range, he was absolutely incredible. He outshot everyone. It wasn't even close. The marksmanship instructors were stunned. This red-headed farmer from Tennessee could hit targets they could barely see. But Alvin's crisis of conscience didn't go away. He continued to wrestle with the morality of killing. He spoke with his company commander, Captain Edward Danforth, and his battalion commander, Major George Buxton, both of whom were devout Christians themselves. These two officers spent hours with Alvin, discussing the Bible, debating theology, and exploring the question, can a Christian fight in a just war? Major Buxton showed Alvin passages from the Old Testament where God commanded the Israelites to fight for their land. Captain Danforth pointed to Jesus' words in the Gospel of Matthew, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." They argued that defending innocent people from aggression was not murder. It was righteous action. Finally, Major Buxton gave Alvin a 10-day leave to go home and think it over. He told Alvin to pray, to read the Bible, and to make his decision. Alvin went back to the mountains of Tennessee. He hiked to the top of a ridge overlooking the valley where he had grown up. He sat there for hours, praying and thinking. He read the Bible cover to cover. He asked God for guidance. And finally, Alvin York came to a conclusion. If the war was just, if America was truly fighting to protect the innocent and stop a great evil, then perhaps God would allow him to fight. Perhaps, in this case, violence could be righteous. It was a painful decision, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life, but Alvin decided that he would go to war. He would trust that God would judge his actions. When he returned to Camp Gordon, Alvin York told his commanders, "I'm ready." Part 4. To France and the Test of Battle. In May 1918, Alvin York shipped out to France with Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division. The 82nd Division was made up entirely of draftees and conscripts, men who had never wanted to be soldiers. They were farmers, factory workers, clerks, and laborers. They had no military tradition, no combat experience, and very little training. But they were about to be thrown into the largest and bloodiest American offensive of the war, the Meuse-Argonne. France in 1918 was a nightmare. 4 years of war had turned the countryside into a moonscape of mud, craters, barbed wire, and death. Millions had already died. The trenches stretched for hundreds of miles, and men lived in filth, surrounded by rats, disease, and the constant threat of artillery, machine guns, poison gas, and sniper fire. Alvin's first major action was the Saint Mihiel offensive in September 1918. The 82nd Division attacked German positions with brutal intensity. Men fell by the dozens. Alvin saw friends torn apart by shrapnel, drowned in mud, shot down as they climbed out of trenches. It was worse than anything he had imagined. But Alvin fought, and he was very, very good at it. His marksmanship was legendary. He could hit a running man at 300 yards. He could shoot a German sniper out of a tree from half a mile away. His fellow soldiers began calling him the best shot in the whole damned army. But Alvin took no pride in killing. Every time he fired his rifle and saw a man fall, he prayed for forgiveness. He believed he was doing what was necessary, but it tormented him. Then came October 8th, 1918, the day that would change Alvin York's life forever. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was in full swing. The American expeditionary forces were pushing hard to break through the German lines and end the war. The 82nd Division was ordered to capture the DeKalb Railroad, a critical supply line used by the Germans. On the morning of October 8th, Alvin York's battalion was advancing through heavy woods near the small village of Châtel-Chehéry. The forest was dense, the visibility was poor, and the American troops were using a French map that none of them could read properly. 17 men, including Corporal Alvin York, were sent on a patrol to locate and silence German machine gun nests that were holding up the American advance. The patrol was led by Sergeant Bernard Early. They moved through the forest cautiously, rifles ready. Suddenly, they stumbled upon a group of German soldiers eating breakfast in a clearing. The Americans opened fire immediately. The Germans, caught completely off guard, threw up their hands and surrendered. 15 German soldiers, including a major, were captured. But then disaster struck. The German prisoners began shouting for help in German. Within seconds, German machine guns hidden on the ridge above the clearing opened fire. The sound was deafening. Bullets tore through the trees. Leaves, branches, and wood chips exploded everywhere. 9 American soldiers were killed instantly, or wounded so badly they couldn't fight. Sergeant Early was hit and incapacitated. The next ranking soldier took command and was immediately shot. Then the next. Within seconds, the entire chain of command was gone. Only 8 Americans were still standing, and they were pinned down, unable to move, with German machine guns pouring fire down on them from above. Corporal Alvin York found himself in command. What happened next is almost unbelievable. While the other 7 Americans guarded the prisoners and returned fire, Alvin York decided to do the only thing he could think of. He would attack the machine guns by himself. He moved to the left, using trees and brush for cover, working his way around the flank of the German position. The machine gunners couldn't see him. They were focused on the main group of Americans pinned down below. Alvin got to a position about 25 yards from the nearest machine gun nest. He could see the German soldiers clearly. They were firing frantically, trying to kill his friends. Alvin raised his rifle and began firing. One shot, one German fell. Another shot, another German fell. Alvin fired with terrifying speed and accuracy. He was using the same skills he had learned hunting turkeys in the Tennessee mountains. He shot from the back of the line forward, just like he would with a flock of turkeys, so the ones in front wouldn't see their comrades falling and scatter. The German machine gunners were stunned. They had never seen anything like this. One American soldier was killing them faster than they could react. A German officer, a first lieutenant, realized his position was hopeless. He stood up and shouted in English, "Stop! Stop! I will make them surrender." Alvin pointed his pistol at the officer's head and said, "All right, but make it fast." The German officer ordered his men to cease fire and surrender. Machine guns went silent all along the ridge. German soldiers stood up, hands raised.
Alvin York, still holding his pistol, marched the German officer down to the clearing where the other Americans were. The captured Germans were gathered together. There were now over 90 prisoners. But Alvin wasn't done. He ordered the German major they had originally captured to march at the front of the column and ordered the lieutenant to march at the rear. Then he told them, "We're going back to the American lines. If any of your men try to escape or if we're ambushed, I'm shooting both of you first." The column began moving through the forest. As they went, they encountered more German soldiers. When the German prisoners saw the massive group being marched away, they assumed they were surrounded by a huge American force and surrendered as well. By the time Alvin York and his 7 men reached the American lines, they had 132 prisoners. Officers couldn't believe it. 8 Americans had captured 132 Germans? Impossible! But it was true. A count was made of the dead German soldiers left behind. At least 25 were confirmed killed, and most of them had been shot by Alvin York. Part 6. The Hero's Return and the Burden of Fame. News of Alvin York's actions spread like wildfire through the American Expeditionary Force. General John J. Pershing, the commander of all American forces in Europe, personally visited York and called him the greatest civilian soldier of the war. Alvin was promoted to sergeant and awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. He also received the Distinguished Service Cross, the French Croix de Guerre, and decorations from Italy and Montenegro. When the war ended in November 1918, Alvin York was the most famous soldier in America. Newspapers called him the war's biggest hero. The New York Times ran front-page stories about him. When his ship docked in New York in May 1919, thousands of people lined the streets to see him. But Alvin didn't want fame. He just wanted to go home. He returned to Pall Mall, Tennessee, married Gracie Williams, and tried to go back to his old life. But it was impossible. Reporters followed him everywhere. People wanted him to give speeches, endorse products, appear at events. Alvin hated it. The Nashville Rotary Club organized a public subscription to buy Alvin a 400-acre farm as a gift for his service. But the farm wasn't fully equipped as promised, and Alvin had to borrow money to make it functional.
Then the Rotary Club couldn't continue making the installment payments, and Alvin was stuck with the debt. He struggled financially for years. In 1928, he published his memoir, Sergeant York, his own life story and war diary, which helped, but Alvin was never comfortable with fame or money. What Alvin truly cared about was helping the young people of his community. He saw how isolated and uneducated the children in the mountains were, just as he had been. So, in 1926, he founded the Alvin York Agricultural Institute, a vocational school that taught farming, carpentry, and other practical skills to rural youth. Later, he helped establish the Alvin C. York Bible School. Alvin used every penny he earned from public appearances and book sales to fund these schools. He gave everything he had to educate the next generation. Part 7. The Hollywood Years and World War II. In 1940, Hollywood came calling. Warner Brothers wanted to make a movie about Alvin's life. At first, Alvin refused. He didn't want his story turned into entertainment. But when the studio agreed that all of his profits from the film would go to fund his schools, Alvin agreed. Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper, was released in 1941. It was a massive hit, one of the highest-grossing films of the year. Gary Cooper won the Academy Award for Best Actor. The film turned Alvin York into a household name once again. But by then, the world was at war again. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered World War II. Alvin, now in his 50s and in poor health, wanted to enlist. He was told he was too old, so he did what he could. He toured the country, giving speeches, encouraging young men to enlist, and raising money for war bonds. He believed in serving his country, even though it had cost him so much. Part 8. The Final Years and Lasting Legacy. After World War II, Alvin York's health began to fail. He had suffered from various illnesses throughout his life, including pneumonia and gallbladder problems. In 1948, he had a stroke. More strokes followed. By 1954, he was bedridden, partially paralyzed, and nearly blind. Despite his condition, Alvin remained sharp mentally. He kept up with current events and spoke passionately about the need for America to remain strong during the Cold War. On September 2, 1964, Alvin Cullum York died from a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 76 years old. He was buried with full military honors in the Wolf River Cemetery in Pall Mall, Tennessee, near the log cabin where he was born. His wife Gracie, who had stood by him through everything, was buried beside him when she died 10 years later. But Alvin York's legacy didn't die with him. In 1986, the United States Army established the Sergeant Audie Murphy Club. The Sergeant Alvin York Award, given to soldiers who demonstrate exceptional leadership and dedication. Streets, schools, parks, and monuments across America bear his name. His home and farm are now the Alvin C. York State Historic Park, visited by thousands every year. And his story continues to inspire. Conclusion. The meaning of Alvin York. So what can we learn from the life of Alvin York? First, that courage is not about wanting to fight. Alvin York didn't want to be a soldier. He was forced into it. But when duty called, he answered. Second, that faith and duty can coexist, even when they seem to conflict. Alvin struggled with the morality of killing, but he found a way to reconcile his beliefs with his responsibilities. Third, that true heroism is humble. Alvin never bragged. He never sought fame. He used whatever recognition he received to help others. And finally, that one person in the right place at the right moment can change the course of history. If Alvin York hadn't been on that patrol on October 8, 1918, the outcome might have been very different. Alvin Cullum York, the poor farmer's son from Tennessee, the man who didn't want to fight, became the most celebrated American hero of World War I. He killed at least 25 enemy soldiers in one engagement. He captured 132 prisoners. He earned the Medal of Honor and the respect of an entire nation. But more than that, he showed us that courage is not the absence of doubt or fear. It's the willingness to act in spite of them. That is the legacy of Sergeant Alvin York. And that is why, more than a century after his heroic day in the Argonne Forest, we still tell his story. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Tomorrow we'll bring you another incredible story of a warrior whose courage changed the world. Until then, remember Alvin York's own words, "I wanted to do the right thing."